There will be no meeting. We have 2 meetings this month. There will be no meeting in July. August is our Bayreuth month, so we don't have meetings during August. And our next meeting will be in September, and it's going to be a members meeting, or as I like to call it, bring and brag and how I spent my summer vacation. So we'll send sign up out and give people the opportunity to come and talk about their exploits, Bayreuth and beyond. So be looking forward to that. I'll get a date. I have to rent a room first before that. October 15th, which is also the opening night of Wagner's Lohengrin in San Francisco. We'll have Professor Simon Williams with us to do a talk about Lohengrin, and I'm sure it'll be wonderful, as it always is when he's our guest speaker. Okay, so October 15th. Then, I already sent an email out to everybody about our big gala event that we're going to have on October 30th with our Lohengrin. Simon O'Neill will be with us as our guest. He will be not only our guest at dinner, but he has agreed to talk about his life, his career, and we might sit at the piano and play a few ditties and sing along. So it's going to be a very big event. We'll be at the Marines Memorial Club, one of the bigger rooms, in fact the biggest room, the Commandant's room. So we can accommodate up to 300 people there. So it is going to be a benefit for our grant fund. You know, and we have an aggressive grant fund. We're sending an Adler Fellow to Bayreuth this year. And so that costs money. And this is how we raise money, is by asking members either to donate outright or come to an event and put a little bisschen in to the kitty for the scholarship fund. So that is going to be on October 30th. You'll get more information. We haven't set the menu yet. We have set the price. It is a benefit. So the price is going to be accordingly. It'll be $200 per person. And but there'll be more information coming on it, that we're just wanting you to mark the date if that's something you think you would like to attend. Yes?
October 30th is a Monday.
It is a Monday.
Yeah. Oh, okay, and the newsletter it said, okay.
It's that Monday.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And October 15 is a Sunday.
I think it's a September.
I'm sorry, pardon me?
October 15 is a Sunday.
Oh, it's a Sunday? Well, maybe if that's the opening day of the opera.
Terry, you said it was September, Simon.
September?
Yeah.
No, September's going to be, I made a mistake. Okay, scratch it all. The only date that's guaranteed right now is October 30th. I'll go back and check my calendar because there was some things that were moving back and forth.
Okay.
Hey, volunteers? Anybody? It's been, and I just got back from Germany. I'm still jet lagged. So anyway, we do have stuff planned for the fall, and I just really want you to mark down Simon O'Neill, his presentation that he's going to give. So we're excited about that. So moving right along. I'm going to introduce our speaker today, who's been a guest, hasn't been here in a while, and we're making up for that. Katherine Syer is our guest today. She taught at the University of Illinois Champaign Urbana in theater studies and musicology departments, and at the Herb Alpert School of Music at UCLA. Her areas of expertise include historical and contemporary opera and theater production, grounding her work as a dramaturg for spoken and lyric theater. Syer's scholarship focuses on Wagner's creative development, and his legacy has been published in several volumes and journals, and I think we have one book here that is got her name on the front of it. Her monograph, Wagner's Visions, Poetry, Politics, and the Psyche in Operas through Walküre, appeared in 2014 on Boydell and Brewer. She is also an international opera critic for over 30 years, and Syer is an avid performing arts advocate, and frequent public speaker. So please welcome Katherine Syer.
Thank you very, very much, Terry, and thanks everybody for coming today. Can I quickly ask how many of you have already attended Die Frau and Schatten here in San Francisco? Most of you. All right. How many of you know Die Wagner's first opera? Die Feen, the fairies, Wagner's very first completed opera. But some, that's absolutely terrific. It's actually scary to hear that I've been an opera critic for over 30 years. I'm a fresh empty nester and I'm feeling a little, older. But one of the things that is so exciting about being here, I was at the performance last night, is that in 1992 on November 16th, I was at the opening night of this production in London. And I was a graduate student cutting my teeth as an opera critic. And my mentor said to me, could you please...
Just a moment.
Oh, did you want me to...
Please, if you would use the
Okay,
microphone,
yeah,
because...
no problem. Should I just...
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. But, so I was a young graduate student, and my mentor, who was working in Amsterdam, said, you really need to see this work. And I said, I'll have to cut classes. And he said, no, you really need to see it. So I rolled up all my pennies. I stayed in a not very safe hostel. I'm glad to be here. And I had a seat in the stalls on opening night with Gwyneth Jones and Jane Henschel. And oh my gosh, it was really quite life-changing. But again, last night when I saw it, it was again life-changing. There is so much in this work. And one thing I want to say is that I want you to have a very open mind and a kind of playful spirit today, because that's, in a sense, what my talk is about. This is a fairy tale, and Wagner was very attracted to fairy tales too. And so I think there's a spirit of playfulness that will ask you to consider some things that Wagner lovers, in particular, take very seriously. But I think this will become transparent as my dire prophecy comes true. Now, when you come to a work like this and you know your Wagner, there are certain things that probably jump out to you that make you think that people who don't know their Wagner in the audience are probably going, what is going on here? Three scenes that jump out in particular that are a real nod to the Wagner lovers would include something like the first illusion for the Ferlin, for the barrack's wife, when the women all start singing to her. And I think most Wagnerians will think of the Flower Maiden scene in Parsifal for a whole variety of reasons. It's an illusion, they're being seductive, they're trying to convince her of something. Another one in Act 2 is when the dyer's wife gives, unwittingly, because the nurse is involved, a sleeping potion to her husband. You don't find that in every single opera that someone gets a sleeping potion. But we do have one, of course, very prominently in Die Walku, so that's something that would probably lodge in your thinking. And another one, a very obvious one, would be the Night Watchman's chorus at the end of Act 1. And you'll think, okay, immediately, we'll all go, oh, it's Meistersinger, I got it, I got the right answer, right? And, you might want to think about that again. It is, of course, an illusion, but the Night Watchman in Meistersinger is sung by one person. And here we have a trio of singers singing in harmony, which is really evocative of a hymn, you would say. So it changes the flavor a little bit. So my point there being is, you get it, and then you have to rethink, oh, what is the purpose here? Maybe it's just a little bit different than in the original source. So those are all sorts of things that I want you to have on your mind. So we have a reference to Die Walku, we have Parsifal, we have Meistersinger already in the mix, and that's just scratching the big-time surface. So, Strauss and Hofmannsthal's possibly most opaque work holds a great deal for those familiar with Wagner's operas. In the time that we have today, I will first consider some experiences Strauss gained as a conductor of Wagner through to his collaboration with Hofmannsthal on the projects which accumulated in Die Frau and Schatten. We will then briefly consider how their first full collaboration, Der Rosenkavalier, established a working method that played forward into future projects. before exploring how some of Hofmannsthal's leading ideas for Die Frau and Schatten launched the text for the opera so that it would accrue many Wagnerian layers as the libretto ripened into a foundation for Strauss's music. This is but a very focused way to carve a path into a very large mountain of material. Recently, Larry Wolf shared with you some of his fascinating material, situating Die Frau and Schatten in the very personal and often sprawling political and social landscape of the opera's genesis, spanning World War I. Let me also draw attention to the work of Brian Gilliam, whose book Rounding Wagner's Mountain is of tremendous value to those interested in Strauss's Wagner's aftershocks. Just by way of information, Gilliam was in the audience last night celebrating the 44th wedding anniversary with his wife. Gilliam quotes in his book a remark Strauss made during the Umweg, or detour, he had made around Wagner's metaphysical mountain, uttered 2 years after his collaboration with Hofmannsthal had ended due to the writer's death. It summarizes Strauss's choice not to emulate Wagnerian notions of art as religion, embodied most fully by Parsifal, in charting his own fresh path as an opera composer. In a somewhat playful but also serious manner, I shall consider a related but different perspective today, namely that Strauss and Hofmannsthal, with Die Frau und Schatten especially, took a deep dive inside the Wagnerian mountain as they pursued a fresh path forward. Strauss attended the premiere performance of Parsifal as a teenager at the Bayreuth Festival, where his father, horn-playing father, not a Wagner fan, performed in the pit. Staking his claim of interest in Wagner's works for the stage, Richard Strauss soon gained experience and pedigree as Hans von Bülow's conducting assistant in Meiningen, and was himself drawn into the creative world of Bayreuth in the 1890s as Cosima worked to establish the festival. Strauss debuted on the Bayreuth podium in 1894 when he led performances of Tannhäuser. However, in matters personal and regarding his own creative work as a composer, Strauss and Cosima did not agree. Strauss stepped back from the insular Wagner family dynamics, married the soprano Paulina de Anna, and shifted his professional energies as a conductor away from Bayreuth for many years. Before the century was out, Strauss's relationship to Wagner's legacy, as it was manifesting itself in Bayreuth, had loosened.
Try the keyboard button.
It worked just a few minutes ago. I have a picture, as you can imagine, of Strauss in a casual setting, and he's rehearsing some of the chorus for Parsifal in 1933. And I used a different arrow. Thank you very much. So when Strauss did return to Bayreuth in 1933, a year fraught with political tensions, it was to conduct Parsifal as a pinch hitter for a new production designed by Alfred Roller. During rehearsals, Strauss openly critiqued the slower tempi that had become the norm in Bayreuth, where a reverent atmosphere had long taken root. A local Munich critic wrote tellingly of Strauss's approach, quote, "With Strauss, the tempo is much livelier than is usually adopted for this sacred play, yet it loses nothing of its pious and heartfelt mood either, something which of course must always be retained. Totally new aspects, tensions, and triggers, which one would hardly have ever expected, are suddenly illuminated. Those long, drawn-out movements, further extended by slow tempi, for instance, in the case of Gouvernements in the first act, become more comprehensible thanks to tighter tempos. Strauss is no mystic, but he is a musician of such great caliber that he managed to convince with his Parsifal performance, despite its veering away from all those well-worn paths." This review, combined with Strauss's earlier choice to distance himself from Bayreuth, already in the mid-1890s, encourages the impression that he maintained interest in Wagner's dramatic art as vibrant music theater. The Wagnerian metaphysical mountain was lodged at Bayreuth. As important a Wagner center as Bayreuth was and is, Munich was by far more productive and a better resourced location in these decades. Strauss was the principal conductor of the Bavarian State Opera. Well, it wasn't quite that, it's still the Hofopera. But from 1894 to 98, and already in 1888, when he was but a junior conductor there, he was given the responsibility of leading the rehearsals for the world premiere of Wagner's early opera Die Frau, in the context of the first festival ever to feature nearly all of Wagner's mature operas. So just imagine, you've got Cosima in Bayreuth slowly adding works to her repertoire, and Munich pulls out all of the punches. The only two works that they did not do from Die Frau on were Parsifal, which was still attached to Bayreuth, and Das Liebesverbot, which local critics at the time said was not performed because it was an international mishmash of styles. So, here we have the playbill for Die Frau in 1888. And what I've circled here in red is really quite striking, because here we have the name of Karl Lautenschläger. And Lautenschläger was a rock star in the lighting world. So, Lautenschläger, when he studied with Karl Brandt, who was, of course, one of Wagner's machinists and stage technicians and whatnot, but then when he got to Munich, King Ludwig, who loved lighting stuff, all right, think the magic castles and the grottos and the colored light, he got his hands on Lautenschläger and said, oh my gosh, I'm sending you to Paris, you need to study lighting. He got back to Munich and he electrified the Munich theaters in 1883, zing, the year of Wagner's death. Bayreuth was not electrified as a theater until 1888, so they're just playing catch up. We know Wagner tinkered with electric lighting. He had a couple of very special effects in Parsifal. Namely, he used electric light from above, a spotlight, like a tight little light on the Grail when it glowed, simultaneously on Kundry when she died. And if you recall the score, the harmonic twist that's tied to the Grail. Anyway, he was a big lighting buff too, but he didn't have the whole house. So Lautenschläger here is lighting things up like you wouldn't believe, and he's getting top billing here as the stage machinist, as well as the Beleuchtung guy for Die Frau. He also went on to fame in 1896 to put in the first revolving stage on continental Europe with Don Giovanni in the same house in Munich. And then when Conried wanted to do Parsifal and break the copyright convention at the Met brought him overseas to completely oversee the stage renovation so that the Met could do Parsifal. So he's a big guy. And Bayreuth's just putting in some electric lights. So, Lautenschläger's production was no mere flash in the pan. It was a tremendous success, revived over 70 times, mostly in the summer until it was retired 11 years later. Also in 1888, the score of Die Frau was published for the very first time in a piano vocal arrangement. Not even the libretto of the work had reached the public eye beforehand, withheld at every possible opportunity by the composer himself from publication, although he published many other texts of incomplete projects, drafts. He did Das Liebesverbot, which was not considered a great success. In any case, as soon as the score was publicly available, writers immediately noticed a wealth of dramatic connections through to Wagner's last opera. The music bore some harbingers too, although much was considered derivative. It was composed in the early 1830s, so that's not a really big surprise. Now, the Schlussszene here, this is an illustration of the closing scene that was all the fuss, basically. So here we see a rendering of the spectacular closing scene, which would have, imagine the lighting effects and whatnot, Lautenschläger's skills and the resources to which he had access. A new production of Die Frau was mounted in Munich in 1910 at the relatively then new Prinzregententheater. It opened in 1901. This theater, when it was built in 1901, was also something of an affront to Wagner, to Bayreuth, I should say, opening with Die Meistersinger. It incorporated the architectural plans designed by Gottfried Semper for a specialized Wagner theater when the composer lived in Munich in the 1860s and had King Ludwig's ear about possibly building a special theater. Although the 1910 production of Die Frau didn't make quite the splash as the 1888 production, a spin-off publication by the assistant to the conductor of the show, Felix Mottl, yielded the first serious study of Wagner's use of the play La Donna Serpente by the Venetian playwright Carlo Gozzi as his primary dramatic source for his first opera. The study does contain some insights, but offers a remarkably rigid, I'm not going to say Teutonic, and blinkered view of Gozzi's experimental theatrical style. As in 1888, many writers continued to emphasize Wagner's original treatment of the material and downplayed the Venetian source for a work upheld as a German cultural gem, even if it wasn't entirely a masterpiece. Now, I'll just quickly improvise a quick thing on the two Carlos. If we're talking about the two Ricards, the two Carlos are very interesting. So in the 1750s, we have Carlo Goldoni and Carlo Gozzi in Venice. And they're both wondering what to do about the aging and somewhat decrepit art form of Commedia dell'arte. So Goldoni decides that he actually is going to write down one of his great improvised plays, The Servant of Two Masters. And they both go towards publishing Commedia dell'arte, which doesn't make sense for an improvised art form, right? But now what Gozzi did, and he bounced Goldoni out of town temporarily. He's still the more famous of the two playwrights now. But Gozzi took over an opera theater, and he started producing his plays based on the Commedia tradition, which has a very strict social hierarchy of masters and servants. And in the mature form, developed by Goldoni and adopted by Mozart, you also have semi-serious noble lovers who spend most of their time just pining away and very obsessed. But so you have this great sort of competition going on, and what's special about Gozzi, or distinctive I should say, is that he took the exaggeration or hyperbole of Commedia and he jacked it up a notch so that you also enter the world of the grotesque. So you have characters who are disfigured, you have things that are gross and gory and like ooh, ooh, that kind of stuff. And you also have fabulous stage effects because he's using an opera house, using that great Baroque kind of stage machinery where you can do wonderful effects. He used orchestras for instrumental music, and it was all very, very clever, right? So he represents kind of the nobility in terms of Venetian society, although his family had run out of money. And the cleverness part of it is that he often referred to well-known classics, Ariosto, you know, all of these things so that the audience in the know was like, I get it, right? So he's got all this stuff going on, but at the same time, he's a bit of an enfant terrible. So in the preface to one of his plays that Wagner knew very well, Hofmannsthal knew very well, lots of people knew very well but didn't talk about it, things like, without becoming at all angry, I proposed that a silly, unrealistic, puerile plot, if developed with skill, artistry, and elegance, could have an effect on the emotions of an audience, commanding their attention and even moving them to tears. So no matter how ridiculous some of the stuff that he put up on stage, he still wanted, at times, for people to be moved by his art form. And he goes on and on. He's really a bad boy, in a sense, because he's got this competition, but he was extraordinarily successful. And what neither Hofmannsthal nor Strauss nor many people knew was that Wagner not only used Gozzi as a young man, but he came back to it again and again and again. And in fact, when he was in Venice in his later years, in the 70s and 80s, every time he went back to Venice, and this is noted in Cosimo's diaries, he'd get out his Gozzi, and he would reread the same fairy tales that he drew on in the 1830s. And one of his autobiographical accounts, Eine Mitteilung, actually has a boo-boo in it, and this is awesome. So, and we'll get into this a little bit better, but one of the ways that he changed La Donna Serpente, which is the woman as serpent, to his story for Die Frau is he changed the ending. She doesn't turn into a hideous serpent. She's turned into stone that he then has to somehow magically bring back to life. So when he was writing in the 1850s, as he's working on things like Siegfried, he writes that he used this source, and he's summarizing, and he says that no matter how somehow gross and disgusting and scary the woman is, he's going to save her in the end. Well, in his opera Die Frau, there's nothing gross or scary or frightening. But there is a scene that he was working on in Siegfried in which he has to overcome fear. And because of offstage voices that have encouraged him, and he's got, woodbirds and whatnot guiding him on and whatnot, he overcomes fear, and he kisses a woman, overcoming fear to do so, which is exactly what happens in the Gozzi tale that Wagner didn't use in 1834, but kept on dipping back into. So he actually talked about the material he was using in the Ring when he wrote about what he did in 1834, and he never corrected it. So there are lots of different ways in which we can be tipped off that this source was very valuable to him for the rest of his life. And some more of that should become transparent in a minute. Thank you for my little Gozzi-Goldoni digression, but Gozzi is, I need to champion him more and more, but Hofmannsthal certainly did. So, by 1910, which is around the time that we have Die Frau up on the boards again in Munich, Strauss and Hofmannsthal had already been generating collaborative ideas for a decade. Key to this story is the fact that Gozzi and the broader world of commedia dell'arte traditions were already providing artistic inspiration in many avant-garde circles to which Hofmannsthal was a card-carrying member. Other manifestations of this trend reached operatic stages in adaptations of Gozzi's Turandot and his Love of Three Oranges. Meyerhold, the Russian artist, published a journal called The Love of Three Oranges. You have Gordon Craig publishing The Mask. All of these masked traditions are coming into vogue as people are looking for new ways of breaking free from that kind of 19th century illusionistic art form. Sort of rejuvenate the stage in exciting ways by using old ideas, by basically bypassing the whole long 19th century. Hofmannsthal's first ideas for Die Frau and Schatten were written down in February of 1911, just weeks after Rosenkavalier had premiered in Dresden, and ideas were percolating for the complicated Ariadne project, which would achieve various forms in the next years. His lead idea was simply a fantastic comic opera in the style of Gozzi, opening line, apparently conceived not in relation to, but on the same night that he went to a performance of Hollander. Hofmannsthal threw many ideas on paper, including a conceptual link involving Strauss's notoriously difficult wife as a model, a beautiful woman who sacrificed her children. So in the first idea, she already had children. Also Goethe's fairy tales, the magic flute, and a torch ship for the fairy empress, along with Solomon's judgment. The next day, he added reference to two commedia dell'arte characters as possible models for Barak and his wife. This comes as no surprise given the work on the Ariadne project that's overlapped, where you have a juxtaposition of commedia dell'arte troupe with an opera seria featuring the pining Ariadne. That project in its many guises affirmed Hofmannsthal's bold commitment to aesthetic disunity, radical juxtapositions of many kinds, and experimentation in general, in part by turning to pre-19th century sources. Aesthetic variety marks the Rosenkavalier project, their first full collaboration, when Strauss wanted to turn towards a comic scenario instead of further pursuing the Nietzschean vein of Dionysian tragedy a la Salome and Elektra. Brainstorming with his close friend Harry Graf Kessler, the pair quickly pivoted their attention to the scenario that would become Rosenkavalier. Kessler was particularly inspired by a French operetta which had premiered just 2 years prior, with a 17th century play by Molière helping to buttress the dramatic framework, featuring two hugely contrasting male partners for Sophie. The opera would be set, however, in Vienna in the 1740s during the reign of Maria Theresa, and include an invented society ritual involving the presentation of a silver rose. And all anachronistically refracted through the okay, I won't move. I shall be like stone. Through, all refracted anachronistically through the extended denouement through musical evocations of the Austrian capital in the later 19th century, specifically waltz music that still flourished at the time Der Rosenkavalier actually premiered in 1911. Yet in the opera, the audience is tugged mightily at times in the directions of Wagner and Mozart, above all the worlds of Tristan and the Marriage of Figaro. In the first act, Strauss's flexible post-Wagnerian musical language is particularly effective in skating back and forth between a kind of self-indulgent wallowing in obtuse language, as Octavian voices his idealistic, metaphysical concepts of love, and the Countess's more frank admission of the ephemeral nature of the erotic affair between a middle-aged woman and a teenage boy blatantly portrayed on stage. Still cutting his teeth, so to speak, as a librettist, and with no musical training himself, Hofmannsthal took direction from Strauss in the form of suggested well-known operatic scenes and strategies of characterization as he forged a text that might invite compelling musical treatment. So for Baron Ochs, in his freshly humiliated state when his bravado has been exposed as non-existent, Strauss suggested Hofmannsthal look at Verdi's Falstaff, another mainstay in the repertoire. The most referenced work in their correspondence, however, is Wagner's Meistersinger. All such works were standard repertoire of the day and as such catered to the audience, but also affirmed Strauss's role as the leading conductor of that repertoire. Here is it's thinking. Ta-da! All right. So here is a list of what Strauss was conducting between 1898, so just on the cusp of meeting Hofmannsthal the next year, up to 1910, when they're really starting to brew some of these eclectic projects. And you can see what he tended to conduct. These were his choices. He was rooted in Berlin most of the time, but also includes the repertoire when he wasn't in his home house and he was on the road. And so this shows how deeply Wagner was under his skin, but not in Bayreuth. And it continued to be the case as he decided himself to be an opera composer. Some of, some of Hofmannsthal's early creative efforts himself, before meeting Strauss, emulate Stauberheim along the lines of the Ring poems. And in 1894, Hofmannsthal noted attending a performance of Meistersinger, so this is a full 5 years before he's face-to-face with Strauss, an opera he would then write down in his diaries as attending many more times, and he professed to admire the libretto extensively. He has a poem from 1895 that celebrates the idea of a Morgentraum, or the morning dream that you would think of in Meistersinger, associated with the genesis of the whole prize song. And if any of you have read about the protracted nature of the genesis of the libretto for Frau, you can see that he took that to heart in his art, because he really was saying, this has to percolate in my subconscious. It's getting there, but just hold on. I know you want another act, and it's coming, but it's got to do its thing before it comes out. Before meeting Strauss, Hofmannsthal explored a network of connections involving E.T.A. Hoffmann as a formative influence, who was also a formative influence on Wagner's artistic outlook. We don't know whether it was because he read Wagner's autobiographical writings, or because he, like other people of his ilk and orientation, were also reading Hoffmann again in the late 19th, early 20th century. However, many writers were familiar with Wagner's autobiographical writings, save for Mein Leben, which came out publicly in 1911, bringing Wagner's biography again and his most extensive account of the genesis of Die Frau to light exactly as they're working on this. Hofmannsthal tried his hand at an adaptation of Hofmann's The Minds of Fallen, which Wagner himself had considered a potential opera project before he wrote The Flying Dutchman. So it suggests he's reading the Wagner literature as well, but also really inspired by Hofmann as Wagner was, but in a slightly different era. Hofmann had pitched Gozzi's fantastic fairy tales as good operatic material, E.T.A. Hoffmann. Wagner already knew of Il Corvo by Gozzi, also known as The Raven, because his uncle had translated. And so he had a really interesting personal copy of that at his disposal, and that was one of the ones that Hofmann suggested would be a good romantic opera, and Wagner turned instead to Il Dono Serpente. Both of them have overlapping material, both in Die Frau and Schatten, and in the material that Wagner would do throughout his life. Just quickly, the whole idea of, you've got the snake transformation at the end of Gozzi. It's then turned into the stone idea in Wagner. And in the neighboring one, Il Corvo, you have a lot of things about birds and blood and wounded birds and tears. So in adjacent tales, you've got a whole bunch packed into one that would follow in Wagner's career and also find its way into Die Frau und Schatten. In addition to an array of fairy tales that Hofmannsthal had in mind, because he's referring to the Magic Flute, he's referring to Goethe's fairy tales. So he's looking at fairy tales of different tradition, the Arabian Nights, he's got all sorts, he's really, the man spoke multiple languages, so when he read Gozzi, he had an 1884 copy in the original language, whereas Wagner used a translation by Werthers, who influenced everybody from him to Schiller to everyone else. So Hofmannsthal is really going to the source. But there's a 1984 dissertation by a woman by the name of Claudia Conrad, and she broke absolutely fresh ground in studying Die Frau und Schatten, in looking at all of the relationships to multiple Gozzi fairy tales, multiple aspects of Wagner, and really kind of opened it up and said, why is nobody looking more closely at Gozzi? But it's a great study, it's hard to get your hands on. But there are people who, if they look at all of the original sources and go through the layers, are finding lots to work with. What Hofmannsthal clearly recognized was the underestimated value of Gozzi for Wagner as a whole, not just Die Feen. Plot and character resemblances are but a tip of the iceberg. So let us take a look at that scene by, I'll just put this up here for decoration. I'm watching the clock, but I'll try to do this swiftly because it concerns the plot of Die Feen. So in this final scene, just to remind you of some of the things that should make you think of other aspects of Wagner as well as Strauss. So, as this draws to a close, the mortal hero Arundel has successfully restored his shape-shifting fairy wife, Ada, back to life, saving her from being entombed in stone in this particular version. Alas, his own actions caused this predicament. In fact, he's made a series of fateful choices. After capturing her in the form of a gazelle while hunting, and then gaining her as his wife and the mother of their 2 children, he failed to heed her command not to inquire about her name. Don't ask me my name. That's bad. So when the opera starts, he's already made that faux pas. So he got too curious. It's already a done deal before Die Feen opens. She's disappeared together with her gorgeous magical realm and garden, leaving him alone in a desert. Servants from his mortal realm undertook a very mysterious journey through the center of a mountain to reach him in the desert and tried to convince him to return to lead his people without success. Ada gives her husband a second shot to be reunited with her, but again he fails to heed her dire but cryptic warnings. She asks him to withstand trials no matter how strange they seem. He misinterprets events, such as her plunging their children alive into fire. A gesture so cruel, when he reads it literally, he can't bear it. So he ends up cursing her, which leads to the whole stone business, But only after he curses her, he learns that she burned them symbolically of their immortality so that they could stay in the mortal world with him. Huh. So, but oy vey, poor Arundel, he's in trouble. Bereft yet again, he has a dream in which his wife has already turned to stone. She calls to him, eggs him on. A pair of nasty fairies from his wife's realm give him one last shot, banking on the fact that he will fail again and possibly die from fear or lack of courage or both. After all, they would much prefer that their wonderful fairy lady ditch her mortal husband and return with them to the fairy world forever. At the start of the finale, the fairies lead Arundel down into a, here at the stage directions, terrible chasm in the subterranean realm where earth spirits with hideous larvae bustle about. There he experiences threatening visual illusions and hears terrifying voices from offstage. But he receives and follows crucial guidance and heroic aids, such as a sword and a lyre from a helpful invisible magician, also sung from offstage, and he reclaims his wife ultimately through song, Orpheus-like. In the Gozzi, by the way, the trials are a little bit different. He has to battle illusions that are giants and things, and the magician says something like, "Cut off his ear!" So he takes a magical sword and he slices off the ear of this giant that's raging at him, and another one he has to dismember on the arm. So here are the grotesque, disfigured things that he has to encounter and somehow surmount. Some cuts were made to the score in 1888, slightly de-emphasizing Arundel's overall psychological development, but foregrounding this great spectacular feat that Lautenschläger had put on stage, with this transformation at the end, all of this lighting effects. Now, the 18th century Venetian, let's see, I'm going to skip this, I am improvising. Oh, I wanted to do something for you. And this is, it's a little perverse, but just go with it. So, when, oh, I hope I put the mark on the right page. Here we go. So this magical trip down the mountain of the servants for Arundel to find him, because, you know, how do you get there? They don't know the way. They're getting to this place where there's magic. So Truffaldino and Brighella have a little conversation, and Brigella's saying, you know, oh, all this magic is just nonsense, and she's just a witch, that lady. We've got to get him back to the the place, and he says, let's see, so they're saying, how did you get here? And he says, this one character, he rushed off to the cave of the magician to ask whether the prince was still alive, and if so, where? And the magician told him to climb Mount Olympus, and he'd find the prince there in a cavern. Truffaldino says, on Mount Olympus, a tavern? No, a cavern, you nitwit. Yeah, because remember, servants always talk about drinks, sex, and food, right? So he's going, a cavern, you nitwit. He also gave him a fistful full of weird spells and some belly patches. Oh, he had a cut, a boil, a boo-boo. No, these are magic belly patches, the nourishment kind. You put one over your belly button and you don't get hungry or thirsty for 2 months. So I brought them to Mount Olympus. The trip took almost 2 months, and our belly patches just about wore out. We entered the cavern, lit our torches, and went in and down 40,007,204 steps, because, you know, they like to exaggerate. And that's how we reached the desert. I don't believe it. You just asked so-and-so, where are they? And then they go on and on. If you take that super seriously, how do you get to the Grail realm? So if you invert all of this intense comedy, there's other material at work, if you take it super seriously. It would appear that Wagner's presentation of the autograph of Die Frau to King Ludwig as a Christmas gift in 1865, which kept it out of the public eye until after the king's death, can be understood as a private placeholder for the new and improved work he specially promised for the king, Parsifal. Not only do key themes and dramatic strategies from Dufay and Gozzi's play resurface in Wagner's last opera, stage directions from the end of Act 2 of Parsifal, when Klingsor's magic garden disappears during an earthquake, very Baroque stagey thingy, to reveal a desert setting, are quoted verbatim from the German version that Wagner had of Gozzi's play. He didn't use it in Die Frau at the beginning, but he came back and used it later. Wagner had not employed this particular scenic effect earlier. With the delayed premiere of Die Frau and the premiere of Parsifal taking place just years apart in the 1880s, in the still early phase of the new German Empire, which celebrated Wagner as a German cultural hero, nobody paid serious attention to the 18th century Venetian fairy tales. If Hofmannsthal and Strauss took Gozzi and Wagner's interest in Gozzi more seriously, the sorts of material that would jump out are what we just mentioned at the beginning. But I'm going to put up some of the text of the opening line of The Nurse. Just recently, there was you might have seen it in, hang on, it should be here. Oh, there's a picture of Strauss in front. This is on the occasion of the premiere of Rosenkavalier in 1911, and to Hofmannsthal, who's right behind him, slightly lit up in this one, is Alfred Roller, who was the designer that they worked with so often in Rosenkavalier and later. And that's Max Reinhardt on the other side, who is a big key player in this kind of experimental theater that they were aiming towards. Now, in the, where I'm going with this is that not only did Hofmannsthal see La Donna Serpente and early Wagner and whatnot as possible material, but all of Wagner. So I'm going to ask you to think about how people who knew Wagner's operas, people like yourselves who were very fond of Wagner's operas, would have read a libretto, not in the opera house, but outside. Remember, the opera house is dark, in part due to Wagner. So you couldn't read a libretto during the performance, so you would read it outside of the house. And this text is obviously complicated. There are so many glitches and zingers in it where you go, where did that come from? That it invites people. It's very, self-referential. Think of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and the gazillions of footnotes and how erudite it is, and look at all the references to the great literature that I'm now tearing apart in my great poem, including Wagner, But when you look at a text like this, I felt so sorry for Linda Watson being asked in a press interview, what's The Nurse about? Oh, it's really hard to sing. Like, who is this character? But if you start thinking of a lot of Wagner in mind, and not just early Wagner, and not just Gozzi fairy tales, you start to get a slightly different picture. So if we look at the nurse's first line, she's looking at the light over the sea, a flowing gleam, fast as a bird, something effervescent, night's treetops lit from above, a fiery hand reaches out to seize me, she's feeling powers and whatnot. So she's a nurse, and I know that she could be considered a wet nurse, all sorts of things in that kind of tradition, but she's a lady in waiting helping somebody. She's a guide, and we know that. She's going to be a guide to different realms and whatnot. How many different guides can you, or ladies in waiting, or helpers, or servants, Dienerinnen, can you think of in Wagner? So who starts off by looking at over the water, rather naively, not knowing that the lady on the ship is in distress? Brangena. Now, if you listen to the music here, she is in distress. She knows something is wrong. Brangena is a very naive kind of, what's wrong with you? You're going to marry the king. You should be happy, right? So there's one reference in the text there, but Strauss undercut it immediately, that we're dealing with a different scene. And then at the end of it, by night, here I am, I keep watch beside your child by night, careworn and anxious. Why? She's got an empress, just sleeping there. What's going wrong? What's so wrong? Are there any people who are substitute parents who complain all about their cares and worries all of the time at the beginning of an opera? Mina, a substitute parent. So, Sorge und Pein, like those words to anybody at the time, like, what's going on? We don't even know the story. This is a prologue, right? So we're supposed to be getting backstory. So all of a sudden she is, you know, I'm really a burdened woman. Oops, sorry. And later on, when the messenger arrives, and this is a good one, in the stage directions, the messenger arrives in blue light. Why? What's the reference to blue light in Wagner? Who comes emerging out of the earth? Right, to give a warning that something's gonna go wrong, right? Blue light. Bayreuth wasn't really up to snuff on their lighting yet. Munich is the hotbed of at the forefront lighting through this time. So the fact that there's a lighting and it's a reference to a character who's going to say, you know, look out, you know, the plots, there's something happening in the plots. And that's what a good prologue does. It tells you what's to come. And then she talks about shape-shifting and whatnot. Oh, sorry, that's later on. Hang on, I shouldn't have done that. I didn't want to do that, and now I don't know how to get back. Hang on. But before anything changes, the messenger refers to her as a Hunden. That's not very nice. You know, really, why does the messenger call her a dog? There are all of these references to animals, birds, gazelles, and whatnot, but it's really quite rude. And then, when the emperor wakes up, the first thing that he says is, you know, are you awake? That's a good Wagnerian line. Schläfst du? Sorry. But, are you awake? And then she says, yes, I'm a dog lying here. I'm your obedient dog. Now, if you think of the whole world of masters and servants, she's playing a bunch of different roles, and she changes her tone as soon as we move from her discussions with the messenger to dealing with the emperor. Now I'm your obedient servant, and whatnot. So she's a shapeshifter too. She has multiple personalities. Now remember, when she goes to take the empress down into the earthly world, how does she set that up? Because the only reason that comes to a head is we learn two different narratives of what happened when the emperor and the empress got together. This is kind of like Sieglinde and Siegmund talking about the fire in their home. They each have different information, but when you put the thing together, you get a total picture. Very Wagnerian strategy. So when the emperor tells us a story, he says, oh, met this gazelle. I fell in love with her in part because she didn't have a shadow. He defines her as not having a shadow as part of his attraction to her. So he's, we know what he's looking for. In any case, he's attracted to her. He talks about in the first intoxicating hour, I injured my favorite falcon, and oh gosh, and now I lost it, and I have to go find it again. So he's injured something that was dear to him as he shifts his attraction to this empress, and in that first intoxicating hour, he lost something important. Anybody else in Wagner lose something important when they hook up with a woman, and they have that first intoxicating hour? Maybe a spear in Parsifal? So why do they both talk about an intoxicating hour? Like it doesn't make sense in the story of them doing that and then losing something. And then when the empress recalls the intoxicating hour and can magically understand how birds sing and talk because she's connected to that world, she adds a very important point. It's not just that the bird was wounded and that it's got blood on it and it's gone away, but there were tears in its eyes. So she adds yet another important cryptic element, which in Parsifal, it's the tears in the eyes of the wounded swan that initiate the moment of compassion. And that all goes back to a scene that Wagner wrote in Die Frau in 1834, in a mad scene in which Arundel remembers killing, hunting his wife and whatnot. And it's a huge, wonderful mad scene in which he's rethinking that he's doing it again, like it's this obsession with, I've got to hunt her again, I'm hunting her again, just like the emperor does in Die Frau. And he does it, and then he imagines, falsely, that he kills her, and that he sees a tear in her eye, and then she changes. So it's this moment of compassion, which is absurd in certain circumstances, and yet by the time we get to Parsifal, we think of the whole notion of compassion, but also in Die Frau ohne Schatten. Isn't that where we actually start to feel moved by the story? When the Empress learns what it's like to be human and then starts to reject, no, I'm not going to steal things, you don't need to bargain me with illusions and whatnot. I know what it's like to be human. And those are the parts of the story, and Barak's very kind of humble approach to life that really move us as human beings in the story that we know through Strauss. But there's a ton of craziness that goes on before that. So all of these little details, if you were a Wagner kenner in 1911 or 1919 when this premiered, and you were looking at this, no doubt, it's not just those big scenes of the Night Watchman, but you'd be going, there's something going on here. And so the nurse, as you trail her path, when she says, let's go down to Earth, and she's like, don't you want to stay here where there are these beautiful places that go up to the heavens? And, like she's pitching Valhalla and dancing girls with drinks and everything. And she's like, don't you want to stay here? No, if we go there, it's stinky. It's gross. There's like snakes and spiders and ooh, and I feel like vermin, larvae, and everything. And she's like totally trying to psych her in. It doesn't look like that at all, does it? When we get there, they're just everyday people, bumping along through an early marriage, having a little trouble conceiving, and all of these things. So she's totally lied to the Empress, right? So who's the biggest trickster of words that goes to a place to try to steal something and flatter, once they get there, the person who owns the gold ring? Logan. So you can start let going of all sorts of gender associations and whatnot, but it's Mima who actually says to Siegfried, I'm going to teach you about fear, because I really have to teach you about fear, because, oh my God, there was this guy who was really weird who showed up, and he's like, oh my God, I'm going to lose my head, and I've got to teach you how to fear, and there's fire, and there's like, oh my God. And Siegfried's like, okay, let's go see Wagner. And the nurse is like, okay, let's go. I need a shadow. So we have this whole notion of the learning of fear and this hyperbole, this exaggeration over the top that happens. And how is it that Wotan as the Wanderer got into Mima's little hut in the first place? How was he left alone? I do remember someone in B flat saying, I'm going out to the forest to meet my friends, the animals. I'm going to go out, so Siegfried goes out in B flat, and he comes back in B flat, as if nothing happened in between. He's a complete parenthesis on the dramatic action. And in between, poor Mima's learned a whole bunch and is sweating bullets by the time he gets back in. He's hallucinating when he sees like shadows in the trees and whatnot. When Barak goes to the market and refers to himself in a self-deprecating way, I'm going to carry these goods, I can be the donkey. He goes out. He comes back the exact same way. Oh, I'm back. Nothing happened in between. What happened in between? The nurse and the Empress showed up. And they totally started to change the game. And the first illusion that the Empress sees, she likens to a Morgentraum. She said, she actually referred, the dyer's wife, she says, oh, this morning dream, and she tries to make it real. And they go, oh, too early. Shouldn't be happening now. And in fact, the nurse doesn't want the whole shadow getting to work. There are so many layers of tricks here. She just wants the whole thing to fail. She really doesn't give a flying potato if the emperor turns to stone. She just wants to go back to the fairy world with her lady, and that's it. The only time that she changes her tune is in Act 3, when she finally says to the Empress, yeah, there's that fountain of life, and if you drink it, you're dead. And she finally tells the truth about all of these illusions that are nothing but tricks. So when you start to look at the score in a different way, there are all of these different strategies that are embedded, little pieces of language, structures of scenes on how people, tune out their attention. What happens when she gives her husband a sleeping potion? She then welcomes another illusion, and then she's not tempted, right? So, pretty weird. What does Linda do? I'm gonna drug you and I'm ditching this place. I'm going with this guy, and guess what? She's pregnant really soon, right? The Empress, by contrast, is tempted, but she's got her wits about her. She's much savvier than, say, Albrecht, who's very gullible. The dyer's wife, I shouldn't get these two women together. The dyer's wife, when she sees these illusions, she's like, what do you take me for? She actually says, come on. She's insulted in a sense. But then she goes and wakes up her husband, and it's like, I almost did it. Which is a very strange, dramatic scenario. And then says, oh, you fell asleep, and whatnot. But she wants at that moment for him to act heroically. She wants him to be not just I'll feed all of the people that come and, just keep working hard. He's very much the fairy tale figure of the father in Hansel and Gretel that Strauss premiered in 1893. So there are all these self-referential things to Strauss's career as well. But when she does that, he's like, okay, I don't get what's going on. And I don't know why that did that. But here we go. It starts to be that he can't understand her language, and he's confused by all of this overly dramatic stuff. And it's every so often there are some strange references to them having tried fertility treatments, and he goes, well, they said she'd be strange. But she's really starting to speak strange language. Think of Siegfried when he wakes up Brunhilde and she starts talking about all of these magical things, and he's like, right? And they don't connect. Well, the worlds start to connect in very strange ways. If you start, and this is where the whole idea of Hofmannsthal bringing two extremely different universes together starts to get weird, even for the Wagner people, okay? So when the Emperor, for instance, he's called by his red falcon. He's so glad he's found the falcon, his first lover in a way. They come back, and then he realizes, oh, she's not here, and all this stuff. And as soon as he smells humanity on them, because both he and the nurse really hate humankind, right? Don't mingle with them, they stink. So what does he do? He starts to think of killing her instantly. That's really radical. Just take a shower. No, he's like, I'm gonna kill her with this. No, I'm gonna kill her with this. And the last time, he's off his rocker. He goes, I'm gonna kill her with my bare hands. And it's like, whoa, you've got a problem. There are people you can see about this. The same thing happens to Barak. All right? So think the biggest weirdo turning point in the whole thing is when the Barak's wife actually says, that's it, I forfeit my shadow, which, funnily enough, she has no right to do. Only the Empress can take it. She can't sell her shadow, right? In any case, which is funny, she thinks she has power. Anyway, she says that, Barak starts to lose it, right? And then the Empress says, I nearly slept with this guy, and she's trying to confess this non-affair and whatnot. Barak refers to her, and this is bold. He says, you're a whore. Those are fighting words. Do you know another opera in which a very innocent woman is called a whore and thrown to the ground in front of hundreds of people? Othello. Right, exactly. So they both become these over-the-top operatic characters, both of them. There's no reason for the emperor to say he's going to kill her with his bare hands just because she smells like she's gone to earth. That's infidelity in a way. And then you have Barak, who's a mild-mannered guy, just off his rocker doing the same thing. And so you see these interconnecting worlds where this hyper-dramatic world of the gods, world of, the Wagner bigger than life is starting to infuse the other one, and then all of a sudden Barak has a sword and it's magically appearing and whatnot. And it's crazy, and the whole thing has to calm down and come back to more Meistersinger, Humperdinck kind of worlds at the end. But the one thing that's really fascinating, and that I think is related to this notion of light, remember that Munich is a light, Vienna is a light, Alfred Roller is a master of light who's working with Hofmannsthal and Strauss. Remember, he's the one who lit all of the Wagner operas for Gustav Mahler. And so he started to paint with light. So de-emphasizing some of the spectacle, but bringing this sense of light to the world, and in a really rich, dramatic way. And of course, they knocked on Cosima Wagner's doors and said, we have this new technology. Adolf Appia, you've got all of these people saying, we should really try this because there are ways that we can do Wagner's works that are just so much more interesting. No, we will do it like the master said. And all of the critics routinely said it was too dark in the opera house, right? And that there was this sense of it being, and that's this mausoleum, this being this sort of rigid mentality. So the strangest scene, which refers to La Donna Serpente, is when the nurse is at one moment with Barak, and she is, not the nurse, sorry, the Empress, and she's really started, her heart is warming up. She's starting to see the pain that is being caused by their visit and attempt to steal a shadow. And she converses with Barak, and then it switches in a very strange way. There's no sense to it. It's a drop curtain Verwandlung. So there's no like, we're going here, we're going there. And all of a sudden she's having a dream. And she imagines her husband in stone. She's also called to the golden fountain. These are all Wagnerian dramatic devices and also operatic devices. You have a dream that forecasts what's coming in the next act, and then it happens, right? So she has this dream and whatnot, and everything seems, sort of strange, and then they're back in the dyer's hut. And that's when everybody says, it's the middle of the day. Why is it dark? Why is darkness in the hut? And, well, it's the forces of Kobad, the dark realm, and all of these huge, weighty forces that we've heard through curses and all that kind of stuff. But darkness overcomes the hut in the middle of the day. That's got to be some of the weirdest stuff, right? And when you start to think of the context of performing Wagner on stage in these years, it starts to feel a little differently. Now, you'll remember that Bayreuth went literally dark in 1913. There were no performances in Bayreuth at all until 1924. So Strauss supported the copyright, the attempt to maintain copyright protection for Parsifal past 1913. The bid failed, so their whole business model was upended. And then add World War I in very quickly, and the inflation post-World War I, and they were dark for a full 10 years. So Bayreuth was silent as all of these Strauss, Hofmannsthal operas were becoming all of the rage. And you have tremendous experiments in lighting in Vienna, Berlin, in Munich, in which Wagner is something so different than what was being done in Bayreuth. And these are a lot of inside jokes that I'm telling you. There are a lot of people who would go to this and say, this is really strange. And who are all of these characters? And they're a kaleidoscopic, absolutely kaleidoscopic look at Wagner's outcome and trails of Gotzi's fairy tales throughout all of them. Hofmannsthal did his homework like you wouldn't believe. His copy of Gotzi's fairy tales is completely marked up. He dove absolutely deep. And there's got to be a little love in this. When you think of ironic treatment of material, sometimes it can be because you're really, turning up your nose at it. But there's a lot of love in this as well. A sense of, we're going to reinvigorate some stuff. We're going to have fun. World World War I changed all of that, you know, that sense of, it was such a difficult work for them to bring out the idea of lost lives or you know, disembodied singing voices and whatnot, fell on very, very different eyes and ears than when they first conceived this project. But if you stand back from it and you kind of take some of that context out and you put a little bit more of the playfulness into it, even the opening is a bit of a joke. Or it's lighthearted, it's self-referential. Kaikobad, you know, that boom, 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 Agamemnon, you know, right at the beginning. But Agamemnon is a tragedy, right? And he is a real force behind that. And in this work, the Empress learns through all of these curses that she has love within her. She says farewell to the realm beyond. And you know, in the appeal to her father, it's such naked, beautiful, vulnerable orchestration. You know, there are those two moments when Brunhilde appeals to her father right before being put through the magic fire, and you know, Ware so shame, like, you know, and you got like almost no orchestration, and I crumble every time. Or, you know, Ruhe to Gott, and all of that, these really emotional moments. The Empress does carry some of that, but she's walking away from that world of control and manipulation, and she breaks free. She cuts loose from the nurse. She says, you know, that's it. And the nurse, she says, you know, you have not learned your lesson from humanity. They are resilient. They encounter challenges, and with patience and endurance, they make it. All of these illusions are nonsense. So there's some beautiful gold there to be had, but it's not the gold of the ring, it's not the rainbow bridge. It's a golden bridge that brings people together and socially connects them at the end. So there is a lot of love in this, but a lot of the jokes, I think, fall flat. And when people, you know, to ask somebody like Linda Watson, who's the nurse? Like, you know, devilishly hard to sing, and she's this wonderful chameleon. And I'll close. I know I've got like way too much material, but I'm going to close with the fact that a character like Loga emerged in Wagner's conception when his notion of masters and servants really changed. So for a long time, Wotan was going to continue to rule. He was going to, you know, continue and whatnot. And it was very late in the game. Remember, started the text 1848. In 1854, when he was out walking in the mountains, he came out and he went, no, I'm going to change this. I'm going to change it. And Loga came into being. And up until that moment, up until the day before, the freshly penned autographs for Das Rheingold and Die Walku were very different at the end. And so, you know, Loga's apostrophe to the audience, you know, you see this magic, you know, there's the rainbow bridge and Valhalla, and isn't it glorious? And the music tells us it's glorious. And he's like, I have a mind to just burn the buggers up, you know? And that is a beautiful instance of Wagner breaking out of the illusion on stage. And many, many directors have done it, where, you know, Loga peeks around the curtain and kind of lets the audience in on it. That's not illusionistic theater, and that is Wagner. That's his original idea. That's not a director. Wagner found ways of taking these very savvy servant figures and working them into the texts and turning things around. Wotan had control over fire until August 1854. It was only taken away from him when Loga was created. He was the god of fire and thunderbolts and everything. That's why at the end of Die Walku, he has to invoke Loga, and that's a marginal addition to the text. It was not the final closing line when he had it. He added it after his hike, and he went, no, this is going to be different. Wotan is not going to rule. So if you look at those texts, and if you look at Parsifal with a slightly less reverent eye and whatnot, you start to see a Wagner that speaks beyond the 19th century, who actually learned a lot from Baroque theater. But Bayreuth did not encourage that approach. So I'm going to ask you to consider, I've way too much material. I'm going to ask you to consider one last example from Parsifal. So, you know, if we're being good Wagnerians and we're never applauding, you know, We're super serious. And we're in there and we see the Grail service and all that kind of stuff. And at the end of it, what does Grunwald say to Parsifal? We've got, this wounded Amphortis, he's hobbling off. You've got everybody marching off. They've had their nourishment. They've had their magical food that's going to sustain them for a long time. And what happens as Parsifal is surprised by all of this weirdness he's just seen, and he can't quite process it all, something's starting to glimmer. But how does Gurnemanz treat him? Yeah, he dismisses him. Use! Go find a goose, Yeah. What a weird thing to do in a drama that's supposed to be super serious about art as religion. Parsifal obviously does not understand why this man is wounded and lamenting and all of that. He's really naive still at this point, but it breaks the tone immediately. And then quickly, Wagner slides in a bit of a prophecy motive, because, just to remind us what's going on, because prophecies have to be repeated multiple times to sink in every opera. And so then we hear off stage the chorus, Durch Mitleid wissen, der reine Tor. So we've got our, compassion and the pure fool, and he goes, oh, you're just a fool, right? He goes, you're not the right one, and everything. And the prophecy isn't completed. It's left hanging. Which is, wait for him. Wait. Be patient. Gurnemanz is not patient, right? He kind of loses his cool. He's supposed to be the guy with wisdom, and he's like, not good character for somebody who's supposed to have all of this wisdom. But again, it's breaking the illusionistic theater experience. Wagner seams it up at the end with the offstage chorus, but it's just another example in which the perception, certainly advanced by Bayreuth in those earlier years and by some of the kind of traditions that have accrued elsewhere too, that if you look a little deeper, there's a much richer surface to be had. And that was certainly the surface and the depths of going through the mountains, going through the valleys, going through all of the silliness, really digging deep into all of this lore that Strauss and Hofmannsthal probably composed the most Wagnerian opera that they could have ever imagined, that many people today will still go, little interesting, kind of curious. Anyway, I hope it's not been too crazy a ride. And I have oodles of more comments, but I hope that makes you think about the work, perhaps a little bit differently. And the whole revitalization of Wagner through staging, through lighting, through all of these things was so slow to happen in Bayreuth. Siegfried Wagner did his bit. He brought in modern technology for lighting in the 1920s. And did some really experimental things with illusions that would be very impressive. But it was always kind of behind the game in that regard. And Strauss and Hofmannsthal, I think, clearly did love their Wagner, but they didn't want to scale the mountain. They definitely wanted to go around or under it.
If anybody has any questions or comments or so on, please.
I have a comment. You made me think. The depth of your material is astounding. It brings up so many layers of theatrical world. And talking about Gozzi is extremely enlightening. He was so influential in Europe in the 1920s, 1930s. He was played by all avant-garde theaters everywhere. But speaking of Die Frau and Parsifal, in the third act, when the Empress dismisses the nurse and she finally enters the door, and all these enticements come, including the golden fountain, the fountain of death, she starts thinking, and she says twice, I don't need the shadow, I don't need the shadow, and I won't drink the water from this fountain. She said a very critical moment when she says, I will not. And these words are spoken, not sung.
Correct.
This she says twice, I will not buy the shadow from this woman, I will not deprive her of the shadow. I will not become happy at the expense of other person by tricking her. And I will not drink. This is similar to the moment in the second act of Parsifal, when Kundry comes to him with all her incitements and enticements and all her treasures, and he is ready. He is ready. And then this is the line that one shouldn't overstep. You don't go from the world of reality to the world of fantasy and become something else. Parsifal is human already. And he clicks in his head, "Our portas de wunde." This is the same moment as the Empress has.
Correct.
Yeah.
If I do this,
Yeah,
it's not what I think it is.
Yes.
It's going to lead in very disastrous
Yeah.
ways.
yeah. This was an amazing moment for me in Die Frau.
It is. Her transformation is extraordinary. There's so much of her that is tied to Brunhilde and this idea of becoming human. She traffics in the
Yeah.
human world. She wants to understand human love. And, you know, I was thinking last night after the performance, one thing that I, as a woman, have always felt difficulties with is that at the end, the Empress, you know, sort of pledges her allegiance to her husband in a kind of, even though he's not any great shakes, right? He's not. And it struck me last night, you know, Brunhilde at the end has been treated like dirt by Siegfried. From the moment he drinks the potion that alters his behavior. And she pledges fidelity at the end, despite that. And it made me think, that's all. But there are all these moments, but this recognition that this is going to lead, and the rejection of it, it's such a strong moment, the rejection of all of this artifice, all of this temptation, and that kind of stuff. It's really remarkable. Thanks for your comment.
Oh, so good.
Is that it? We have no more questions?
We've been.
Yes, it was quite a lot, quite a lot to digest, but you took us on multiple magic carpet rides.
That's what I wanted, and I wanted it to not be too serious. I've spent way too much time in dusty archives, in Bonfried and Naxos, Siegfried Wagner. I was looking at all of these materials and whatnot, and to actually see some playfulness with it. I mean, it was such a hard time, the early 20th century. I mean, if you think of the darkness and the despair and looking at these strange theatrical forms, breaking free from Stanislavski and naturalism and whatnot, some of that kind of seemingly kind of perverse, grotesque, playful circus. Think of the circus in Baroque's realm, when you have all of that percussion. Max Reinhardt was a great proponent of the circus and this whatnot. There was a desperate need to somehow kind of unbutton some of that heavy worship of the 19th century, both in a kind of troubled way and in a desperate and also in a playful way. So,
And the class structure that started happening.
Oh.
These poor Nibelung working in factories and
well, and
all that.
Wozzeck at
and
the same time,
spit
you
out
know,
like
working
nothing.
with character types, you
Yeah.
know, very much 2D role models and whatnot. It's
Yeah, human experimentation.
yes,
It's really some
absolutely.
unbelievable cruelty. David?
I'm not that, I know of Gozzi, but I'm not that familiar. Could you discuss him a little bit?
In around the 1750s, he, as someone attracted to the Commedia dell'arte tradition, which I have to say asserts social and class structures, right? So you've got master-servant relationships. And then somebody like Mozart instead uses Goldoni, that uses master-servant relations to invert them in anticipation of the French Revolution. So say for the marriage of Figaro, you have servants who come out. And they carry their weight. Despina was a character. And Goldoni did that. He started to promote them. Gozzi, totally different guy. He's like, no, we like the old Commedia dell'arte. I'm up here and you're down there. So he wasn't doing it in a progressive way, but he wanted to do it in a way that catered to the nobility. So there are references in the text to well-known texts that they would know that the everyday person wouldn't know. And it was entertainment. So he would do all of these fantastic stage tricks, illusions, and have music and whatnot. And he really reigned the stage for a few years in Venice. And then he was translated into German, and the Germans loved him. But all of the translations modified all of the class structure stuff. So Veritas, that Wagner used, it's already post-French Revolution, and you've got, this move towards democracy. So the servant figures are more like buddies, as opposed to, groveling for food that's left over and whatnot. It's a little bit smoothed out. So Gozzi has undergone many different transformations, often through translation. And when we get to Hofmannsthal, he starts going back to the original Italian and really understanding that there's a class structure at work, that they're in a very precarious time in terms of world politics, and all sorts of things like that. But he went under the radar. You go to Venice now and you see the Via Goldoni and whatnot, and Gozzi's a minor figure there. There's the Goldoni Theater and whatnot. And both of them, in their very different ways, wanted to preserve the improvisatory nature of Commedia dell'arte that had been around for generations. And they both started to write down their plays, which is not improvisation. But there are moments, like the one I read about the going into Mount Olympus, in which the actor who performed that role was supposed to do it as a spontaneous improvisation. It could not be done in an opera because of that. So that those sorts of parts wouldn't be there, and they would have been done kind of on the fly. And it's interesting because one of Wagner's leading ideas about performance for actors was fixed improvisation. He writes about this many times. So he wanted actors to do it as if it was freshly improvised. But of course it's not. It's been rehearsed and it's known super well. So there's many dimensions to the Commedia tradition, but Gozzi's very distinctive. And he's in the know. All of those high literature references nobody gets today. But we get Othello, we get Falstaff, we get Singer, we get, Magic Flute, and that kind of stuff, in part because the repertory has come with them. That's one thing that Strauss really fought against when he took up the directorship, the co-directorship of the Vienna State Opera. It became the State Opera in 1920, but in 1919, he was a little tired of this fact that the same repertoire was being done over and over again. But there's a flip side to that, because his work is playing with that, right? He's playing with that. But think of the Ghosts of Versailles, right? Corleone at the Met, he was playing with the fact that people knew their Rossini, their Mozart, and everything, so that people in the audience go, oh, I know who that character is. Oh, I know that too. That kind of thing. And Gozzi was doing that too. But there's some interesting sources. This is easily available and has his prologues. This has got several versions of it. It's on Amazon. And it has his prologues, which really make it transparent that he was doing this as a provocation. He wasn't doing it to say, here's my well-made play. At all.
What's the name of the book?
It's just 5 Tales for the Theater, Carlo Gozzi. It's a beautiful translation. It doesn't add in a bunch of modern stuff or whatnot. It includes the and it's really nicely done. And Gozzi has been revived also in recent years. Julie Taymor, the director, has done Gozzi in various formats too. But it's obtuse. It's hard to access, and you maybe a little bit more today than yesterday will understand some of the references to Wagner that go very deep in Die Frau and Schatten. The average person, even if they know their Mozart, even if they're a regular opera goer, they're going to be really baffled by a text like Die Frau and Schatten for certain, because it's that kind of sort of in the know thing. And that's part of modernism in the early 20th century. so many of these writers trying to figure out what to do with this legacy of great art that they felt ambivalent towards. Sometimes they cut it up, Cubism is a kind of fracturing of imagery, or poetry, all of these illusions in ways that don't readily make sense, and there's so much writing that adopts that style. But lots of
Well, one thing that came out to me in the performances of all the others that was, and it goes back to the class thing, is I was looking at Frau as an allegory of capitalism. The whole, there's an exchange, there's a buying and selling going here, and it's the rich people taking the most valuable thing of the poor people and exploiting them.
Absolutely. I mean, class, the whole master-servant thing, it has meaning in Wagner's time, it has meaning in Gotzi's time, it has meaning around the fall of the Habsburg Empire and World War I. I mean, there's so many layers there that can be pursued as well. But yeah, class structure is important. And it's interesting because the emperor...
Also economic structure.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Economic structure too. And that also, I reflected anew on the role of the emperor, because he's not anywhere close to being on the same plane as the empress, and he really aspires to be in Kaikobad's realm, because he, like the nurse, looked down so strongly on the smell of mankind. That is really, really strong. He aspires to be not, and that's two levels of the human realm. The emperor is not in Kaikobad's realm. There are three distinct places here. He would much rather be not bothered with anything to do with the human realm. And that's interesting. And he's mad at his wife, ready to kill her when she starts trafficking humans.
Yeah. There is another thing that rings true today. It's the issue of unborn children. We know what's going on today in the United States. I thought that at the end, the two pairs kind of united in love. The dyer's wife starts loving her husband, and the empress acquires a different dimension. She can have children now. And to me, it was like children should be born of love, and only on love. Children cannot be born if there is no love between the partners.
Thank you. Thank you. What kept me up last night, well, many things. I can't go to the opera and not stay up all night thinking about this. There is only one opera in all of Wagner in which a child is conceived.
Could you go to the...
There is only one opera in all of Wagner in which a child is conceived. And it's right. And it's Sieglinde. And why do they have a child? Not because they love each other. It's because it's been predestined that these two mate to further Wotan's power and race. And maybe get a hero who can get the ring back and steal some gold and power and whatnot. It is not a child conceived in love. In Die Frau ohne Schatten, when Barak leaves, and there's this when he's drugged, so very, very Valkyrie, he's drugged, and there's this temptation of a beautiful man, and she resists. And then she wakes up and tells him about it. She doesn't conceive, she doesn't have sex, right? And when Hunding goes to sleep, Sieglinde and Siegmund have sex and immediately get pregnant. They don't have to wait 2 years, 3 years, bango, right? And that is the wrong reason to have a child. And there's a moment when the Empress in Die Frau ohne Schatten, it's not a child conceived in love. It's all the wrong reasons. And there's a moment in which the Empress feels such compassion for this woman who's going through this incredible ordeal. And she says, I'm going to defend you. I went, whoa, Brunhilde! And what does Brunhilde do with this woman who's pregnant, who's just lost her husband. She goes, I'll protect you, and she packs up the broken sword, of course, because that sword's gonna help, right? And she takes her off to some godforsaken place where she dies in childbirth, never to be seen again. And Siegfried is not a success story, but Brunhilde is. And so, you know, when I saw this opera for the first time, I was in my early 20s, and I immediately thought, this is really wicked stuff about reproductive systems, you know. I was not married, I wasn't thinking about kids and everything, and the literal part of it hit me like, you know, I remember going to the Crush Bar afterwards, and I was talking to my mentor, and I'm going, this is really strange for me to see, like, does it bug you? Like, and, you know, and obviously this is something that comes up. When Strauss and Hofmannsthal were working on this, Strauss said, people who read this text literally are gonna have a problem, right? And that's true with Wagner. If you read a lot of Wagner literally, you're gonna have a lot of problems. How about Siegmund and Sieglinde getting together? You know, that's a big problem. And Hofmannsthal really argued for the sort of symbolic dimension of it. But go back to La Donna Serpente, and you go back to Die Frau, and you have this scene in which this man sees his children burned by fire. And he goes, you told me never to curse you, but this is it. You burned my children? That's it, I'm gonna curse you. And she turns to stone. And so if you take that in a totally lighthearted, symbolic way, and Hofmannsthal was extremely playful in a very clever, maybe sometimes overly clever way, that is the one source that has this idea of whatever in the fire. And the whole time the Empress and the nurse are playing with Barak's wife's imagination, right? So she feels guilt and whatnot. She looks at, when he comes in, just fish in a pan to him. Just fish in a pan. Nothing more, nothing less. He wasn't there that whole time when all of these shenanigans were going on. He was boom, 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 being his donkey going off to the market, and he comes back, and he has no idea of the shenanigans that have gone on, and it's only the wife that looks at this and feels this incredible guilt and awful things and whatnot. He looks at him, just fish in a pan, but I'm not really hungry anyway. And then he goes on away. So, I don't know, maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. But I did think about that thing with Sieglinde because of this idea of children being born in love, social connection, families being together, which is so cherished in this work. That denying, like invoking Sieglinde and then changing that fate, but still having the Empress saying, you know, I'm going to protect this woman. I'm on this woman's side. I'm changing sides. Is very Brunhilde. Anyway, sorry for going.
Okay, well, I think we probably should, we could go on forever and ever and ever, and probably shouldn't.
No, I know, you all have a
And
right.
we'll have Katherine back again for another topic, for sure, in the future. And thank you all for coming. I hope you
Yes, thank you
enjoyed
for
it.
enduring this. Remember, this is about resilience and overcoming challenges and patience.